In Virginia Woolf's poignant A Room of One's Own, the author imagines that Shakespeare had a, quote, wonderfully gifted sister, and muses on what this woman's life would have looked like compared to that of her famous brother. Woolf argues that because of her sex, such a person would have been uneducated and unknown, and her genius for fiction, uncultivated. Due to social norms, familial expectations, and religious rules of the period, any woman, this is Virginia Woolf, any woman born with a great gift in the 16th century would certainly have gone crazed, shot herself, or ended her days in some lonely cottage outside the village, half witch, half wizard, feared and mocked at. Woolf indicates that Shakespeare's imaginary sister perhaps scribbled some pages on an apple loft on the sly, but was careful to hide them or set fire to them. She certainly would not have published poetry or drama, not for lack of talent, but for lack of sport. For instance, most early modern women could not lay claim to a lineage, so to speak, of writers to whom an author can look for inspiration and encouragement. In The Mad Woman in the Attic, Sandra Gilbert and Susan Grubar argue that a female writer is the daughter of too few mothers and seeks to form a female literary tradition, a secret sisterhood of literary subculture, all while fighting against a radical fear that she cannot create. In other words, women writers do not enjoy a genealogy of literary foremothers comparable to that available to men, and therefore may find authorship daunting and perhaps even illicit. Historically, writing has been considered a masculine endeavor and therefore inappropriate for women. Indeed, we know of many instances in which women destroyed their own work, whether out of obedience or fear. Other women employed pen names to protect themselves from scrutiny, not only of their writing, but of the fact that they wrote it all. For this reason, among others, Woolf comments, I would venture to guess that Anonymous, who wrote so many poems without signing them, was often a woman. It was never the case that women lacked the talent for writing, or rather, they lacked the resources, education, and societal approval to do so. Oftentimes, women's writing is uncovered or rediscovered. Its absence from traditional literary studies makes it suspect for many critics, who assume that the principal marker of a work's value is its presence in a literary canon, or in other words, the body of texts deemed important, influential, and valued. Absence from the canon, of course, is due to a wide variety of factors. For example, non-canonical works may include manuscripts to which access is severely limited, or the few copies of a book that survived a natural disaster, such as the horrific Lisbon earthquake of 1755 and its subsequent fires. We lost a lot of stuff in that moment. Even works that appeared in print and were sometimes reprinted fall into obscurity for a number of reasons, including the social and religious norms laid out for women throughout the centuries. In her book, How to Suppress Women's Writing, Joanna Russ lays out a series of oft-repeated, albeit unjustified, reasons why we should not take seriously texts written by women. And imagining herself a critic arguing to exclude these works from the canon, she says, she didn't write it. She wrote it, but she shouldn't have. She wrote it, but look what she wrote about. She wrote it, but she isn't really an artist. It isn't really serious or of the right genre. It's not really art. She wrote it, but she only wrote one of it. She wrote it, but it's only interesting or included in the canon for one limited reason. She wrote it, but there are very few of her. And I've included a bingo card here in case any of you need to use it for future conversations about women writers. Deeply ingrained prejudices such as these make the mere existence of texts by women from the Iberian Peninsula, which now comprises Spain and Portugal, some dating back to the Middle Ages, even more astounding. Let us take as an example Filipe Yamada, a 15th century Portuguese poet whose work was deemed important enough to include in Mercedes Rezende's Cancioneiro Geral, 1516, a collection of the most important Lusophone or Portuguese-speaking medieval poets. Yet over the centuries, poems by authors such as Dom Diniz, King of Portugal, which appeared in the very same collection, have been consistently preserved, taught, and studied, while Almada's beautiful O que recobrar não posso, What I Cannot Recover, this is Dr. Hickson's translation, an astute study of the human condition is not standard fare in the Portuguese literature classroom. It does not have a place in the canon and therefore is not recognized as great literature. Certain literary critics vigorously defend the canon as it currently stands, arguing that the works we deem classic, to which we ascribe value, have been preserved over the years purely due to inherent merit. This implies then the omission of all other works is unquestionably justified. One such critic, Harold Bloom, criticizes any attempt to expand the canon, calling the proponents of such an attempt the rabblements of lemmings who hurl themselves off the cliffs, attackers who seek to destroy the canon, and high priests of anti-canonizers. And just as a side note, his capitalization of the word canon seems to indicate he considers it nearly sacred. As you might imagine, I take issue with Bloom, who refuses to recognize any outside influence on the creation of the canon, whether racism, sexism, ableism, politics, text preservation, language, translation, or any of the many other factors that may exclude an author or text. I argue that creating a more expansive and inclusive canon does not destroy it, but rather recognizes the forces that amplify some voices while silencing many others. Indeed, acknowledging the merit of Philippe Diomade does not diminish the works of Shakespeare. In the last few decades, a growing number of texts written by women have found their way into the literary canon. More than ever before, college students have the opportunity in their regular curriculum to study women writers, in part because of social changes and in part because of the dedicated efforts of scholars who recover and study forgotten texts. This is especially true for Iberian studies. Although this expansion of the canon is very promising, many more women authors and their texts continue to languish in relative obscurity. Therefore, Dr. Valerie Hagstrom and I are currently creating a comprehensive database of women writers from the Iberian Peninsula from the Middle Ages to the 19th century. The database owes the first part of its title, More Than Muses, to Dr. Hagstrom, who only encountered one early modern female writer, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, during her graduate studies. It's a very different experience from mine. It was widely held that Sor Juana, a nun from New Spain, which is Mexico today, was the only Spanish language woman writer until the late 19th century. Determined to uncover more texts by women, Dr. Hagstrom dedicated her career to recovering female authored texts from archives across the Iberian Peninsula. As she conducted research, she noted that authors and critics often use the phrase the 10th muse to describe women writers. This allusion to the 9 muses of Greek mythology, who served as inspiration from everything from poetry to dancing, is problematic for several reasons. First, there cannot be more than one 10th muse. Although meant to praise, the epithet loses its meaning when applied broadly, reminiscent of when Elastigirl in the movie Incredible says, "Everyone's special, dash," and her son replies, which is another way of saying no one is. Another problem with the muses appellation is the fact that the Greek figures were meant to inspire the creation of the arts, but they were not themselves creators. Hence the title, More Than Muses. We want to underscore the fact that the female authors included here were not the inspiration for male writers, but rather were authors, playwrights, and poets themselves. Our online database of women writers comprises author biographies, diplomatic transcriptions of texts, and current bibliographic information related to the texts and their authors. Additionally, this website serves as a repository for new editions and translations of works created by carefully mentored BYU students. Providing editions in the multiple languages of the Iberian Peninsula, eventually including things such as Catalan, Catalan, Galician, Basque, and Arabic, in addition to Spanish and Portuguese, as well as English translations of works not readily available, will facilitate wider dissemination of lesser known texts, allowing students and researchers alike better access to the works of women writers and criticism on those works. What is more, the database will be searchable, not only by author or by title, but also by language, century, and region. We anticipate that this digital library will greatly support the teaching of works by women writers in Spanish, Portuguese, comparative literature, and women's studies courses in universities across the United States and in other countries as well throughout the world. Certainly, this is a formidable task, and we have only just begun. Dr. Hagstrom and I could not have launched the database without the generous funding provided by the Emmeline B. Wells Grant and 2 College of Humanities mentored experience grants. During the summer term of 2021, we hired 7 student interns, 3 of whom were graduate students, to create content for the website and asked Dr. Jeremy Brown from Digital Humanities to design More Than Muses. And without his help, this would look like a terribly amateur blog, but it doesn't. So we're thankful for him. Our student interns conducted research, wrote biographies, annotated bibliographies, in addition to creating the first editions included in the database. In fall 2021, we worked with students enrolled in our women writers classes in both Spanish and Portuguese as they create even more content for the site, particularly transcriptions and editions of works unseen for hundreds of years and largely unknown to literary critics. And I know that Dr. Hegstrom has students this semester which were still working on this project. So I would actually like to invite all of the interns and students who have contributed and who are currently contributing to this project to please stand up and be recognized for their groundbreaking work. I know you're here. Not all of them could be here today. There are many more than this, but I just wanted to take a moment to express our appreciation for you and your hard work. So thank you. These students were diligent and committed, but not all immediately convinced of the need to recover women's writing. When teaching courses on women writers, I have found that students often question the need for special courses or anthologies featuring texts and writers who occupy societal and literary margins. This is certainly not to imply that students are inherently misogynist or Lumian defenders of the canon. It simply indicates the need to help guide learners into new ways of thinking. Since even professors and literary critics sometimes minimize the need for expanding the literary canon and questioning the reasons behind the systematic exclusion of certain authors and their works, we cannot expect our students to operate outside of this paradigm and challenge widely held beliefs about what makes works classic. Indeed, at the beginning of the fall semester of 2021, several students in my early modern Portuguese women writers course required a justification for a class focused solely on women writers. As one student responded when asked about his expectations for the course, I wanted to determine for myself whether or not female writers from the early era needed to receive special attention, or if the increased attention for female writers was just due to the recent political feminist movement. Fair question. Not all the students shared misgivings about the writers or their works, however. Other students explained, I honestly just wanted to see more examples of women in literature, and it happened to be Portuguese and Spanish women. And I expected to read a lot of books from women writers. One said, I really just wanted more exposure to Portuguese literature and to understand more of the older writing, while another wanted to learn about women at the time, to learn something different and unique. I felt it was imperative for these students of Lusophone literature to become fully invested, not only in the course, but also in the creation of the More Than Muses site. And while each student came to class with different expectations and differing levels of interest in women writers, the database served as a catalyst for appreciating and understanding the value of the texts, as well as the need to expand the canon. The most efficacious tool in encouraging students to appreciate and feel ownership of these texts was mentored learning. Dr. Hegstrom and I worked closely with our interns and our students as we developed this website. The first step in this process was to explain the scope of the project and the necessity of preserving women-authored texts. The students' first task was to create a diplomatic transcription, which is a faithful rendering of original text using modern typeface. Because the Portuguese-speaking students were working with printed text, they had to learn about the typographic style and rules of the early modern period. For instance, they had to distinguish between the letter F and the letter S. So this first example, those are S's, and those are F's. So if you know the difference, you're doing great already. They often look the same. They also came to understand the extra word or portion of the word located at the bottom of each page was not to be included in the transcription, as it was merely an aid to the printer working to arrange the pages in the correct order. They agonized over line breaks and odd spacing between punctuation marks. Why is there a space before this comma? They worked through antiquated spelling to understand meaning. So I've updated it here. You can tell it's a little bit different. And their principal mission was to recreate the text as accurately as possible in a digital format. Once this task was complete, the students created pedagogical editions of the text. They were meant to facilitate the teachings of these works. Students had to comply with contemporary rules about spelling and punctuation in addition to following modern poetic norms. For example, for poems by sort of Violante Seu, they had to remove all of the uppercase letters at the beginning of poetic lines. They replaced Y's with I's, and they carefully omitted extra N's, H's, and L's. You see how much the language has changed. They removed commas placed before the word and placed tildes on nasalized words. Students also had to decide how to work with titles and marginalia such as these, which provide the subject of the poem at hand, as well as relate it to a specific moment during Catholic Mass. So the top part is the title of the poem, and on the side is a little note, because each one of these poems is related to a specific point during the Mass. For their part, most of the Spanish-speaking students worked with the manuscript such as this one by Maria Igual. So I know which one I think I would choose to work with if I had the chance. You can see here that they had to work with scratched out words, corrections, and sometimes illegible handwriting. For obvious reasons, their task was even more arduous than that of students working with printed texts. In short, our interns and students worked with early modern writings and made them intelligible to speakers of modern Portuguese and Spanish, creating editions that are accessible even for those who know nothing about early modern language or printing practices. The next step in this process was to identify references that required footnotes. The students researched Latin phrases, Catholic liturgy, obscure biblical references, and mythological figures. For instance, they discovered the meaning of the word osculum from Latin, meaning kiss, in reference to Judas, and they learned that the priest kisses the altar when approaching it during Mass. Students learned that memento refers to the first word in Eucharistic prayer. They made connections between Delicta Juventutis Mea and Psalms 25:7, and they understood that diligite inimicos vestros means love thine enemies. We asked students to define, explain, and footnote as many unknown allusions, phrases, and words as they could to make the texts more readable to other students just like them. These editing tasks forced the students to read closely and deeply. They not only gained a better understanding of the text, but also a sense of ownership related to the authors and to the site itself. For example, when one of my students realized that because of time constraints, a particular work would not be published in its entirety on the database by the end of the semester, he suggested quite sincerely that he and his classmates should double their workload as a way of accomplishing this. I love this story. Although his colleagues did not share in this feeling of urgency, they certainly sympathized with his intentions. This was their project, and they were fully committed to it. In addition to asking students about their expectations for the course, I also asked them about what changed for them during the semester. One expressed surprise. There are a lot more female writers than I expected, and I certainly did not expect the majority of them to be nuns. Another admitted candidly, sometimes I do find myself asking, why do some of these texts matter? I think that all of them would be something that should be required reading for literature classes or anything like that, but I do think it's important to give them some exposure. And I think there are definitely some hidden treasures and pretty good works. And sometimes change is incremental, and that's okay. My expectations for myself changed because I wanted to understand better the material, and it pushed me, pushed myself to be a better student because the content was dense, but so very rich. Another student wrote, it made me want to really dive deeper into the lesser known authors. It gave me more of a love of history than I ever thought I'd have. Indeed, our database contains many of these hidden treasures by lesser known authors, which we hope to turn into visible treasures by well-known authors. Now, lest you think me an uncritical cheerleader of meritless works, let me tell you about just two of the authors included on our website thus far. I will start with Sora Violento Seu, who I've mentioned before, a Portuguese nun born at the beginning of the 17th century. And if you would like to know more about this writer, I would invite you to look her up. We have a biography on her on our website. Although there is no evidence that she received any kind of formal training, Sora Violento's natural talents became apparent when she was very young. She wrote before and after becoming a nun and participated in and won many poetry contests. She also played the harp, understood science and politics, and wrote in Portuguese, Spanish, and Latin. Her 1646 publication, Rimas Várias, or Various Rhymes, contains 97 poems written in 12 different poetic genres. It's not a slouch. Her posthumous 2-volume 1733 work titled Parnaso Lusitano, or Lusitanian Parnassus, contains 252 villancicos, which are short dramas, in addition to 100 sonnets, 13 canciones, 9 silvas, 4 elegies, 4 epistles, 3 octaves, 35 deprecações, supplications, 8 romances, 22 redondillas, and 1 decima. We also know that she penned 2 prose works and 1 3-act play, none of which unfortunately are extant. They're no longer existing. Sora Violento's appellation in both Spain and Portugal was the phoenix of Lusitanian ingenuity. And she was, to quote the biography on our site, one of the most accomplished representatives of aesthetic and mystical poetry during the 17th century. And yet, Sora Violante was not even the most prolific early modern Iberian writer. That designation belongs to Sora Maria do Céu, another nun inhabitant of Lisbon, born about 50 years after Sora Violante. And this biography is also available on More Than Muses. Like her predecessor, she also wrote in Portuguese, Spanish, and Latin. During her lifetime, she published 9 books containing poetry, drama, and prose, and some of these, as you can see here, were second editions of her works, attesting to their popularity. In addition, archives in Coimbra, Porto, and Lisbon, they're all cities in Portugal, contain several of her manuscripts, and 2 other works by her are not excellent. Sora Maria was well educated and well read, having studied Luís Camões, Lope de Vega, Luís de Góngora, and Francisco de Quevedo. If you want to know more about any of those, I can talk to you afterwards. She dedicated poems to the Jesuit priest Padre Antonio Vieira, corresponded with the Portuguese Marquise of Maialva and the Spanish Duchess of Medinaceli and Arcos, all highly influential figures. When she died, the most important newspaper in Portugal at the time, the Gazeta de Lisboa, published her obituary. These are just 2 examples of women writers who, despite having produced texts that their contemporaries appreciated and celebrated, have been omitted from the canon, while works by their male counterparts, including those mentioned above, Luís Camões, Lope de Vega, etc., continue to appear in literary criticism and literature classrooms. Some critics argue that the religious themes present in the women's writings have excluded them from the canon, but if this were true, then why do literature professors continue to teach Padre Antonio Vieira's sermons? Why do we still read Dante's Inferno? Why is Pilgrim's Progress considered a classic, while Enganos do Bosque, also a spiritual allegorical tale, languished in obscurity for centuries? And what about those texts that rest squarely in the other category, such as personal letters or equally personal spiritual biographies? What about texts that only ever existed in manuscript form? Did they have a place in the literary canon? In response to these questions, I suggest that we consider, first off, the Voynich manuscript, which has fascinated scholars for over a century, despite being completely indecipherable, and which has appeared in a print edition for the very first time in 2016. We should also remember the inimitable Fernando Pessoa and his famous wooden trunk found posthumously, full of over 2,500 poems and letters that have become the most significant portion of collected works. Scholars are still editing, publishing, and translating these texts more than 80 years later. And we should certainly not dismiss William Faulkner's manuscripts, letters, and hand-bound book of poetry discovered in 2012 that sold at auction for thousands of dollars. I imagine that we would not argue that these works are not valuable or are not literature simply because they were personal writings or in manuscript form. I argue that we must extend the same consideration to texts such as the letters that Dona Leonor de Almeida, the 4th Marquise of Alorna, wrote to her father while he was in prison. The canon is not as egalitarian and merit-based as we have been led to believe. Rather, economics, politics, social norms, religion, and many other factors have contributed to the exclusion of certain texts throughout the centuries. Now, to return and respond to the dismissals laid out by Joanna Russ. Iberian women did write, and they absolutely should have written. They regularly wrote about the same things as their male counterparts. They really are authors. They often penned more than one text, and their works are interesting for a variety of reasons. Lastly, there certainly are more than just a few of them. Case in point, in the Women Writers seminars that Dr. Hegstrom and I taught last semester, we included texts by 42 women. And considering that we only studied women from the medieval period until the first half of the 18th century, and that we had to omit many other authors, there is clearly a wealth of literature written by women yet to be discovered and taught. Recovering authors such as these is, of course, the principal objective of our project. However, an important byproduct is the mentoring of students. When I asked my women writer students at the end of the semester, what is the value of the More Than Muses database project? I received the following answers. There is great value in this project because not only is it valuable information about these women from the time period, their writings, poems, and literature in Portuguese and Spanish, it contains diplomatic and pedagogical editions of their writings. This project contains critical and vital information from these women that would not have been known to the public if it weren't for this project. Here's another. Portuguese and Spanish literature are already so underrepresented. Spanish and Portuguese women writers are at the bottom of the list of works to be read. I think that the database will help provide accessibility to their works. It was priceless, all caps, priceless. I think that this course gave me an appreciation for literature in a broader and more real sense because we got to know each author in their lives. I think that it is a great way to help people access works that they otherwise would not have access to, works that have great literary merit and certainly add a wealth of knowledge to our current canons. I think it is valuable because it makes this literature accessible to more people, when previously it had been largely hidden in libraries or in other private places in the Iberian Peninsula. I think it can also be very helpful for understanding history, particularly what life was like for many of these women. I love it. It's fun to do during class because you become a lot more interested in the content as well as the lives of the women writers. It is valuable to have online so more people can study about the women writers. I love working on something truly meaningful to the research community. I often feel like all the essays or assignments I do in school are not really contributing anything real, but this project felt like it was actually contributing to future research. I would like to underscore certain words in these responses: value, valuable, critical, vital, underrepresented, accessibility, priceless, appreciation, merit, wealth, knowledge, helpful, fun, and meaningful. Because the students contributed directly in important ways to the database, the project became personally significant to them. Not only were they rightly proud to see their names and their editions published online, they also felt their work and their efforts were truly meaningful. They knew they were impacting the real world, the real academic world at least, by recovering these texts through transcription and editing, thereby making them available to everyone. Through mentored learning and the creation of the More Than Muses database, students better recognize the value of this literature, both as literary and historical artifact. Our contributors' work simultaneously breaks down their own previously unrecognized biases about how cultural products are valued, while also expanding the canon for further study and inclusion of marginalized voices. As we move forward with this project, we will continue to work closely with colleagues and those we mentor here at BYU. We will add images, translations, and pedagogical materials to support the study and teaching of women-authored texts. Our vision is to build this digital library through the collaborative contributions of students and scholars from across the globe, and to create the principal repository for the works of all Iberian women writers in every language and genre. We are deeply committed to preserving these texts and recovering the silenced voices of women who were, after all, much more than muses. Thank you.
Dr. Halling's research into female writers in Portugal and Spain began with her master's thesis here at BYU, where she was taught by our very own Dr. Hegstrom. Since then, she has also received her PhD in Hispanic literature from Vanderbilt University. She was a professor of Spanish at the University of Southern Indiana until 2016, and she began teaching Portuguese here at Brigham Young University. Dr. Halling is also quite the linguist. She speaks fluent Spanish and Portuguese. She is learning Italian, and she even knows a little Danish. Dr. Halling's research primarily deals with female writers from the Iberian Peninsula. This includes women from the Middle Ages all the way through the 19th century. She has written half a dozen articles with several more on the way. Before the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, Dr. Halling attended dozens of national conferences and presented her work at conferences in San Juan, Puerto Rico, Lisbon, Portugal, and Salamanca, Spain. As we discussed today, one of the greatest undertakings of her professional research career has been the creation of this More Than Muses database. This database archives the work of female authors, playwrights, and other writers on the Iberian Peninsula. While there are other similar projects being done for just Spain or just Portugal, Dr. Halling and her research partners recognize the importance of creating a database of both of these countries together because Spain and Portugal share a rich history and culture. And to separate these brilliant writers based on modern day borders is wrong. While Dr. Halling and Dr. Hegstrom have been recovering writers from many writings for many years, there's a lot more work to be done. More and more literature by women from over 100 years ago is being recognized. However, there are still many who languish in obscurity. Dr. Howling expects that this work could be ongoing for the rest of her career. In most cultures throughout history, the writings of women have been suppressed to the point of almost being forgotten. The Iberian Peninsula is no exception. Dr. Howling's work is important because it is restoring history and art that deserves its chance to shine in the literary canon. Not only is her work a priceless contribution to bringing to light underrepresented voices, Dr. Howling has also brought many students into the work. The More Than Muses database Dr. Howling has created can act as a template for future research for all cultures in every part of the world. Like I said, the suppression of writings by women is definitely not unique to Spain and Portugal. While there are other similar projects for other parts of the world, like the Recovery Hub for American Women Writers and the Brown University Women Writers Project, this important work is nowhere near complete. We are grateful to Dr. Howling for the countless hours she has selflessly put into this project and doing her own work to correct history and amplify women's voices that had previously been silenced. We'll now open the mic to questions you may have for Dr. Howling.
We will now progress into the Q&A session. If you have any questions you would like to ask, please line up behind the microphone over there. And if you are watching this lecture on Zoom, feel free to ask your questions in the chat. We will end the Q&A session at 12:55. Dr. Howling, you went to school for both Spanish and Portuguese and wrote your master's thesis on women writers from Portugal and your dissertation on theater and converts in Portugal. Was there a catalyst that pushed you to focus on female writers in your studies? If not, how did you come to study female Iberian writers?
That's a great question. And I hope that throughout this talk, I have made clear that this is a joint project with Dr. Hagstrom. And I owe sort of my beginning interest in women writers to courses that I took with Dr. Hagstrom when I was an undergraduate and also as a master's student. I was introduced by her to the idea of convent theater, and I was already sort of a theater person. And I was really fascinated by the notion of women putting costumes on over their habits and performing plays with props and sets and music and dancing and all of these things in the convent for other nuns, or sometimes perhaps for larger audiences. And so that I just really was fascinated by that idea. I also was able to visit a couple of convents when I was doing research for my dissertation, meet with the nuns, give them my camera, have them take pictures of places where they still do theater today. And I just sort of fell in love with the idea of women writers in the Iberian Peninsula. And I felt sad that not everybody knew about these texts. And so I wanted to lend my voice.
Hi, so I am a Middle East Studies and Arabic major. And so my question is, like, you obviously mentioned a lot of Spanish and Portuguese writers. How do you feel the academic treatment of Arab women writers or Muslim women writers at this time might differ from Spanish and Portuguese, or like how have you like incorporated the differences between those two cultures in this database?
This is a great question because texts in Arabic by women writers, that's something we absolutely want to include in our database, but we need Arabic speakers like you to help us out. And I think that Arabic writing on the peninsula is largely ignored because most scholars don't speak Arabic. They can't read Arabic, right? And so there has not been a lot of integration, right, of those texts into the literary canon of Spain and Portugal. And that's something that we would like to remedy, at least in part, by including Arabic-speaking women who lived on the Iberian Peninsula in our database. So thank you for that question.
So Megan on Zoom asks, what do you think is the main reason why such women's writing was celebrated by their contemporaries and yet completely lost to us until now, unlike Jane Austen's writings, which have been preserved?
That's a great question. I think the first thing to note is that Jane Austen was a lot later, right? And in the case of well, in lots of cases in Spain and Portugal, we know of lots of instances in which women write something, particularly thinking about nuns, write something like a spiritual biography, their life story at the behest of a spiritual advisor, and then are commanded, ordered to burn it afterwards as a sign of humility, right? So we know that women were writing even more, and we don't have those texts. Sometimes those texts were not preserved because they were written by women or because they were in collections belonging to women. It reminds me of, I don't know if you know the book Galileo's Daughter. It's a great book. It's a collection of the letters that Galileo's daughter wrote to him. And we don't have his letters to her because she was a nun and that was not preserved, right? We have Galileo's archive because he was Galileo, right? And so I think there are just so many factors involved here, but it is true, you know, Soto Maria de Seo, they were celebrated during their time period. They were printed, they were reprinted, right? They participated publicly in poetry contests and won them, right? And so I think there are a lot of factors that have to do with politics, natural disasters, like the earthquake in Lisbon, and the burning of archives, the loss of libraries, things like that. Translation, right, is an issue. Jane Austen, we know Jane Austen because she wrote in English, right? And so it's very accessible to us. If nobody's translated these works and you don't speak Spanish or Portuguese, how do you access them? So I think there are a lot of factors.
My question is, are there any databases or digital libraries that are similar to this one where they really focus on the writings of women in different languages? And if so, what is something that you learned from them that has helped with the project? And if not, what are you hoping that people can learn from More Than Muses?
Yes, that is a great question. I actually want to maybe pull one up here. Let's see. Get it right. Here we go. Here's a great example done by a friend of ours, if this decides to load. And it is focused solely on women writers in Portuguese before 1900. And this is a great resource. You can look by, what's the word, century? Siglo, século, I don't know, whatever language I'm speaking. You can look by century and pull up information on these different people. There's some biographical information. There's a bibliography here. And there's also a database for women in Spain. One thing we didn't want to do is we did not want to separate Spain from Portugal. We didn't want to separate Spanish writers from Portuguese writers, in part because we have lots of Portuguese writers who are writing in both Portuguese and Spanish, right? In part because Spain and Portugal are so interconnected. And we just wanted to represent the peninsula as a whole. The other thing that you'll notice here is that the bibliography is not annotated. And we wanted to give people a little bit more help in this area. So our students annotated bibliographies. They did a great job. So you can look at the bibliography and say, I more or less know what this article is going to be about. And I think I should read it because it will be helpful for my research or not, right? One other thing that we have done is, or we are continuing to do, is to include full texts on our website. A lot of these will indicate the title of a work, but they don't necessarily have the work itself. So we want people to be able to access biographical information, bibliographical information, and the texts. And we're also working with Drs. Carr and Haig right now to have their students create translations of these texts that we can put on here as well. So we want to have sort of all the things. It's very ambitious. Oh yeah, that'd be great. When we have modeled this, let's see, what is it? Is it just Sophie Project, WYU.edu?
Sophie.byu.edu. It's now gone over to the library database.
Perfect. So I was going to say this looks different than when I.
Yeah, we just transferred it to the library.
Okay.
So now it has all of our works plus.
Perfect. Perfect. So this is something that we have taken as our model. And if you don't know this database, it's a fantastic database, and it's German-speaking women. And we look up to Sophie and want to be like Sophie. And so this is, we want to be this resource. We want to be the place people go to learn about women writers in the Iberian Peninsula.
Dee on Zoom asks, after studying a few medieval women writers, I felt I had finally found old literature that actually resonated with me. Have you found that as a woman, you find themes and points of view in this kind of literature that resonated with you more than their male counterparts? Or are there themes and content mostly similar to traditionally acknowledged male work?
That is such a great question. I definitely have found that I feel more personally connected to a lot of these writers. And even though, for example, some of these women are writing about religious topics and their male counterparts are also writing about religious topics, they're approaching it in a very different way. So when I read, for example, Saint Teresa talking about, spiritual experiences in your life and communicating with Christ, that is deeply meaningful for me in a way that maybe other writings might not be.
So that will conclude the Q&A session and the lecture. Let's all give one final round of applause to Dr. Howling for this wonderful presentation today.